talk about visceral fat in alignment with one of the conversations that happens all the time on the podcast, which is metabolic health. And this is where people are consuming too many carbs, spiking the blood sugar. Insulin comes in trying to bring that back down. Over time, doing that chronically, you're going to have insulin resistance, eventually type 2 diabetes. That's just a quick overview. But talk about, in parallel to that, as somebody is becoming metabolically unhealthy, what's happening with visceral fat on the inside that we can't see?
Yeah, so it's really accumulating, and maybe a quick. I know we covered this image last time, but for the sake of anybody new and for sake of recovering this, we'll just quickly go over it again. So it's best to see what happens to visceral fat when you eliminate one of the most important things to eliminate in terms of a dietary strategy, how we should be eating. You want to be eating clean. And when we eat clean, we don't eat processed foods. So you can simply eat meat and vegetables in whole form, and you will have the same results this individual had here, which is this guy is filled with all this visceral fat inside here at his baseline. So that's week 0. 35 weeks later, let's look at the impact that cutting out processed carbohydrates had. He eliminated almost all his visceral fat. And if you compare the two images from the beginning, he's got a dad bod up here in this image, initially at week 0. And now he's got a body more like a collegiate athlete, somebody in his 20s. Even though he's 68 years old, this guy put on muscle, grew a six-pack, eliminated visceral fat, and he did that, Jesse, without exercising 1 minute. So the take-home point for anybody listening and watching is that you do not want to be consuming processed foods, especially processed carbohydrates, because that will accelerate and will lead to the accumulation of visceral fat, the enemy inside of you. So visceral fat is first and foremostly caused by processed foods through the mechanism that you talked about. And I find it more helpful to focus in on visceral fat than insulin, glucose, homocysteine, C-reactive protein, ApoB, or any other biomarker that you might want to follow, because they're all downstream of visceral fat. And when you tweak and manipulate visceral fat, those others will either improve or get worse, depending upon what happens with visceral fat. So if you find labs particularly complex, then just focus on visceral fat. That physician that came out and said, it's interesting, you don't have to worry about visceral fat. He sells services really interpreting laboratory studies. And I'm like, don't have to sell. You don't have to buy interpretational laboratory studies. If you simply follow your visceral fat, all those other ones will get better. And so you don't have to go to doctors. You don't need physician intervention. You just need to get rid of visceral fat. Now, one proviso: if you break your leg, you're in a car wreck, you get shot, you fall out of a tree, then you go to a physician for emergency care and treatment of that. But when it comes to lifestyle and how you should be living, you are in the best position to make decisions about what you should be doing based on eliminating first and foremost visceral fat. So that's what I'd recommend doing. You don't have to go to an MD, somebody complicated, a lot of training and expertise. I'm just going to tell you for free. That's what you do.
Just as a thought experiment, though, trying to tether those two stories together, somebody that's on that road to being diabetic, being insulin resistant, having that happen, say, over the period of 10 years, can we assume what we're seeing here on the screen of the visceral fat, you're showing it disappearing, but we could look at it the other way too, where it's building up over time. As somebody's becoming more insulin resistant, would the visceral fat in tandem be accumulating?
Yeah.
Could we look at one and get a good idea what's happening with the other?
Exactly. So that's precisely what happens. You see with the progression of poor lifestyle choices, the accumulation of visceral fat, and also the story of health is consistent throughout the body. We see it all over, especially when it comes to visceral fat. So maybe a good example is taking a look at this image. And I don't think it was available. We didn't talk about this one. We talked about it in different form, but I got some new images since the last time we talked. These are only about 3 weeks old. And so we did have this image, which is the healthiest abdominal scan I have ever seen. This is a single best MRI scan I've ever seen. He's mostly dark because this individual is mostly muscle, and these muscles are enormous and they're clean. Now, in this individual up here, you can see white streaks and white deposits in their muscles. And that's because fatty infiltration is happening. That means inflammatory fat is begun to invade the integrity and space of that muscle and get incorporated. And if you're listening and you're thinking about that concept, fat developing and being laid down like a lattice inside your muscle, you would be able to understand how that might impact and impair the functionality of that muscle. That's in fact what happened. This is a former college football player gone amok through diet. They simply just started consuming carbohydrates. They increased processed foods, and now they're mostly entirely white inside. They've got these big, huge love handles inside of them. And that fat is also now, look at that, in their legs. And it looks like Wagyu beef. So I call that human marbling. Compared to this guy, who's an Olympic sprinter named Emmanuel Matadi, one of the fastest men in the world. And look at his muscles. He has almost no fat whatsoever in his muscles. It's just like beef tenderloin or filet mignon. So the take-home lesson is how much visceral fat you have tells the story how much fat you have in your legs. And so both of these fat depots, these markers of fat, both are inflammatory, both cause disease. Both of them are ignored by conventional healthcare. So what do I mean by that? If you get an abdominal CT, an abdominal MRI, or an MRI or CT of your legs, they will not read this highly inflammatory fat. And this fat in particular was interesting. About 5 months ago was identified to double your risk of mortality, death, compared to obese people. So you probably already know that if you're obese, you don't live a long life. You just don't enjoy the life expectancy of an average person. Well, double that mortality, meaning 2 times the risk of death of an obese person, is somebody that has this fat going on their legs. Don't you think you'd want to know that? Well, unfortunately, the healthcare system doesn't think you need to. They don't tell you about it. Now, before you think, why in the world, aren't those doctors telling you about it? That's awful that they're not. The truth is, the doctors don't know about it. My best friend is an orthopedic surgeon. He did not know of the alignment of those fatty infiltrates in those legs and its association with visceral fat and decreased quality of life and death and rate of mortality. So it took AI to pick that up. Now, my research partner and I for the National Science Foundation started to piece this together because we saw the healthiest individuals like NFL wide receivers and running backs had remarkably low levels of this, and they also, because they had low levels of visceral fat. And it was our older patients who had accumulated for decades visceral fat had the highest amounts of this fatty infiltrate. The technical term for it is myosteatosis. So you should jump on Google, get educated about visceral fat myostenosis, because you're not going to get educated about them from your doctor, the healthcare system. There are some I'll just come out and say it. There's some decision makers who are specifically suppressing these markers from humanity. And guess what they have you doing, fools? They have you following cholesterol. Why? Because nobody gets better when they follow cholesterol. Your life doesn't get better, but your life would get better if you followed this type of fat. And so that's what Dr. Sean is out there. I'm trying to get people aware of. You should track what really matters. In the research realm, we call it signal. So what really matters, which you pay attention to in research, is the most relevant markers. And the other markers that are basically distraction, they're called noise. So when it comes to signal, visceral fat and myosteatosis are your highest amounts of signal to follow when it comes to optimizing your health. And cholesterol is filled with noise because it basically is a distraction and nobody really gets better optimizing their cholesterol.
Well, while we're on the topic here, the bad fats, let's add a third layer in. So we have the visceral fat, we have the infiltration of the muscle, and the other one of the three is the deep subcutaneous fat, or the love handles.
Yeah.
So let's add that into the mix.
Yeah, so let's pull that up and see if we can isolate this right here for the sake of the audience. So in this particular screen, you can see this black line that goes along this edge here. That's actually a membrane, Jesse, that's called Chappus fascia. Now, collectively, where these love handles are, this fat in the periphery, just temporarily, I'll reduce it again so you can see the fat, the white on the outside is called subcutaneous fat. And subcutaneous fat is divided into two compartments. And the difference between these two compartments is like bricks and clouds, I like to tell people. So what that means is the subcutaneous fat has two component parts. One is this superficial part right here. It's just on the outside, just underneath the skin. And that superficial subcutaneous fat is really good stuff. It actually reduces your mortality, reduces your amount of disease. It's associated with protecting the liver against fatty liver disease. It reduces your mortality from cardiovascular disease, meaning heart attacks and strokes. And so how does that happen? You should ask, how could a fat be good? And it's because this type of fat, instead of secreting all this inflammatory stuff, inflammatory molecules like interleukin 6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and resistant and adipokines and cytokines, chemokines that come from visceral fat and deep subcutaneous fat. Superficial subcutaneous fat secretes this wonderful molecule called adiponectin. It's spelled exactly like it sounds, adiponectin. And so you should Google it if you're listening today. You want more of adiponectin. You don't want any of the visceral fat and deep subcutaneous fat. So the cool thing about these love handles are, in every individual that I have scanned in the past year, specifically looking at their deep subcutaneous fat, it always corresponds to visceral fat. Always. Now, what does that mean? It means that maybe you don't have to get an MRI, possibly. That you could see how much visceral fat becomes a proxy by looking at your love handles. So if you got love handles, super bad. That means you got visceral fat. But here's one proviso to this. The majority of people, I'm concerned, will look at those visceral fat, their love handles, and they'll just say, oh, I have visceral fat, got rid of it, and work to get rid of it. But compared to individuals that get an MRI scan, and then they see all of this stuff inside, the former people that just look at their love handles are not going to be as motivated and disturbed as the man or woman that scans and sees that on the inside, they are mostly inflammatory disease-causing fat than anything else. So I tell people, quit fooling around. Spend your money on things that optimize your health. Sell your freaking car, your Rolex watch, your Coach bag, or whatever it is that you're spending your money on. That stuff is going to go away. Your body and rather those other things are far more important. So get an MRI scan. They're available at $500 to $1,000. Sometimes as cheap as $300 if you live in Los Angeles. You can get them pretty cheap. And so the MRI won't let you lie. It tells the truth. It tells you what's going on. And, I'm on the internet. I get a lot of people saying I have low levels of visceral fat. Well, they think they do. Many people do. They come to me and they're filled with it. So don't be misled. The MRI does not lie. Get an MRI, know for sure. You cannot tell from a bioimpedance scale. The DEXA scan is not nearly as accurate as an MRI. And even if you get a DEXA scan, it's just going to give you a number. And a number is not going to trouble you as much. If I told this guy his number, you think he's going to change his life? No. But, by him seeing this, it changes his life. And when I saw that amount of visceral fat, and especially these legs, I couldn't even talk. I was so troubled at the amount of disease that was, had progressed and allowed to accumulate inside those people. So I'm a big proponent of looking at these biomarkers and looking at them in the most effective technology to motivate human beings to change their lives and improve their lives. And that's what we should be doing. We should always be improving. And let's face it, 99.999% of humanity is not improving. They're getting worse. And if you're listening today and you're not convinced of it, buddy, girl, get your photographs out and take a look and see what's happened to your photographs. You want to see that you're actually improving and that your not only your appearance, but your performance is improving too. Right now, I could do more pull-ups and push-ups at the age of 60 than I ever could in my life at any point. I thought I was really, hot stuff. At the age of 16, I could do 16 pull-ups, but now I can jump up on that bar and do 24. So I'm way ahead of the game to where I was when I was a teenager.
As you talk about these different types of fat, good and bad, that are releasing different things into the body, and we talk about testing, it gets me thinking about, is there some kind of blood work or test we can do to detect some of these inflammatory markers released by visceral fat? We have the MRI, we know it works good, but I'm just wondering, is there other options there?
Yeah, what you can. In fact, I used to spend millions of dollars doing these tests because I was a concierge medical physician. So yeah, you can measure interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor, resistant, insulin, all these things. But guess what? They go up and down. So maybe you measure it and it's down low and you're like, I'm good. And then a few minutes later and a few hours later or a few days later, it's way up. So it's dynamic. But what is static and just slowly gets better or slowly gets worse, depending on how you're living your life, is visceral fat. So I can order any test I want. I'm a physician. Guess when the last time I got a blood test of myself? 7 years ago. And I'm a health and performance optimizing physician. But I check my MRI scans every few weeks. So I'm on that to check my visceral fat, and I follow skin markers on my skin and other external biomarkers. But yeah, I think everybody is spending a lot of money unnecessarily following these labs that go up and down when you really just want to follow that visceral fat, because visceral fat and fatty infiltrate within the muscles always improve or always worsen all those other labs.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
Visceral fat causes inflammation throughout your body, leading to disease. It starts when you're young. It's the first expression of disease in the human body, and it continues throughout a lifetime. I tell people